I was disappointed.
Average.
Sad.
Garbage. Different.
Cheap.
You could describe Justice League in one word, what would that word be?
Trying.
The whole movie was just really like, the storyline was really like messy and sloppy and gross.
I didn't like the Flash.
I mean, like the big superhero team up like the Avengers, I was expecting like that quality of a movie.
I didn't like Batman.
I heard it distort like justice.
I hate Superman.
I didn't like Flash.
Yeah. The fact that the Flash wasn't represented enough in Justice League, I feel like it just bothered me a little bit. But I'm not gonna get into that. That's personal.
Special effects weren't that great.
Am I allowed to do spoilers?
When Justice League came out, I was super hyped for it, and then I was just really let down.
The Justice League. What exactly happened to this movie? What was supposed to be Warner Brothers employees' ticket to rolling in box office bonuses turned out to be one of their biggest flops. We think the reason for its embarrassing collapse can all be traced back to two big things: studio interference and two directors with completely different visions. These two things actually explain a lot of the muck that ruined this film. First of all, the studio got scared of the negative reviews from Batman vs. Superman and the negative chatter about how dark the DC movies had become. Therefore, being the geniuses that they are, the studio execs decided to bring in another director to do these reshoots, when Zack Snyder had to drop out due to a family tragedy, to make the film lighter and funnier. That director was none other than Joss Whedon. Sound familiar? That's because Joss Whedon was the director of Marvel's massive hit, The Avengers. And honestly, Joss did the best he could. But whenever you mix two completely separate visions, the result is always an off-putting mismatch of tones. Especially when one was very dark and serious, and the other was kind of forcefully funny.
Do you really think that...
Oh, wow, they really just vanish. Huh? Oh, that's rude.
Most are even certain that Superman's entire character arc was changed during the Joss Whedon reshoots to show a much lighter and less dark Superman. That's not the only problem, however. Reshoots this large in nature are not only difficult, but also very expensive. The studio ended up spending far more than their original budget, which added to the film's box office flop numbers in theaters.
This brings us to the other major studio interference that painfully hurts this film: a rushed release date. Not only did the studio force reshoots to make Justice League lighter and funnier, they also forced the filmmakers to finish the movie and have it out in theaters by the original November release date. This is an insane thing to ask, therefore post-production was rushed and it shows. Warner Brothers isn't the only one to blame for some of the post-production problems, however. Remember when we said that Superman's entire character arc had to be changed in reshoots? Well, during the time of the reshoots, which required a lot of Henry Cavill, he was working with Paramount Studios on Mission Impossible Fallout. The only issue? Henry Cavill had a mustache in the Mission Impossible films, and Paramount wouldn't let him shave it off. So Warner Brothers' rushed post-production team had to try to erase Superman's mustache and replace his whole upper lip in practically no time before its forced November release, which left most moviegoers with nightmares of Superman's terrifying plastic upper lip, which he had in nearly half of his scenes in the final film.
The final step the studio took in trying to utterly destroy their own film came from the fear of long superhero films. Apparently, the studio had heard some buzz that fans were getting tired of super long superhero films, and so they forced the filmmakers to make the movie less than 2 hours long. To give perspective on that, Zack Snyder's original vision was a 2 hour and 50-minute film. So not only did Joss Whedon have to reshoot half the movie, he also had to make a practically 3 hour long narrative, work in less than 2. I don't care how good of a filmmaker you are, but it is very hard to completely change a story in the editing room. It just never works out well, and the Justice League movie proves it. All in all, Justice League was a mess, but it's important to note that it wasn't entirely the filmmaker's fault. Both Joss Whedon and Zack Snyder put forth their best effort, but ultimately too many negative factors got in the way of Justice League emerging as a halfway decent film.
Thus, its whopping score of 40% on Rotten Tomatoes and its secured spot as one of Hollywood's biggest and most confusing box office flops.